Yep.
All right, great. Well, again, welcome everyone. I'm glad that you are here for this this new training, this advanced small group training. And I think most of you are here today because you are experienced with running Alpha. I know some of you are newer to it, but that's perfectly fine. I think you'll be able to follow right along. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask at the end, or just connect with me personally, and I'll help explain anything you didn't understand. So perhaps if you've been running, your Alpha small groups for a while, you might just be wondering, gosh, how can we make them better? How can we give them more energy? How can we have better conversation? And you know the basics, but maybe you're just looking for that little something extra to take your small groups from good to great. So today we are going to talk about the 5 essential elements to having meaningful and dynamic small groups. And those really are relying on prayer, creating the right team, inviting the right guests, extending radical hospitality, and facilitating great conversation. And so you might look at that list and say, well, Bonnie, I signed up for this because I was really looking for the secret stuff. So if we have any Space Jam fans out here who remember this movie from, I don't know, 20 years ago, I think, not the reboot, but the original. Bugs Bunny's little Looney Tunes team was looking for Michael Jordan's secret stuff to make them be better basketball players. And Bugs's message to them was, the secret stuff is in you, and you just need to access it and go deeper into it. So as we look at these 5 things, they might sound simple or familiar to you, but we're going to drill down deeper into each one of them. And I'd love for you just to try to pay attention and think about which one or ones do I really need to focus on? Which ones could be game changers for our Alpha? If you look at them, you'll notice that the first 4 really are not about small group. It's really the last one, facilitating great conversation, that happens in a small group. This just kind of reinforces the importance of setting the right foundation for your Alpha small group. And once the foundation is set, you'll be able to have great conversations. So let's get started with the first one, which is relying on prayer. Prayer, as you know, is the heart and soul of Alpha. Everything on Alpha begins and runs and ends with prayer. It's the most important thing. And yet so many churches really don't emphasize prayer enough. The Alpha team might be praying, but the congregation isn't praying. So often at churches, Alpha is viewed as, their thing. That's what those Alpha folks do, but it's not our thing. It's not our collective thing as a church. And if that's the case at your church, then your church will not get involved in praying and inviting their unsaved friends. The training that I'm going to be doing next month on creating a Great Commission culture within your church is going to really explore that, how to tease out really getting your congregation more deeply involved in the work on Alpha. So I'd encourage you to check that out. So you want to draw the whole church into Alpha by talking about Alpha regularly. I mean, it doesn't have to be every single week. At some churches it might be, but you don't have to start out that way if you haven't been doing that on a regular basis. But you do want to share testimonies on a Sunday morning and in the regular communications that go out from the pulpit, and in other sorts of print and electronic communications. A lot of churches will say, we do that, but they just do it the 3 weeks leading up to Alpha. If you want your church to begin to engage in the ministry of Alpha, you need to begin doing it much more regularly than just the 3 weeks before Alpha. What you could do in the few weeks before Alpha, again, I would recommend doing it much more in advance than that, is to share the Luke 11:02 cards that we have on My Alpha, so that the congregation can begin praying for who they will be inviting to Alpha. You can also have a 24/7 prayer room leading up to each Alpha. Again, these are just some ways that you can get your entire congregation praying. And once they start praying and engaging with Alpha that way, then they'll start inviting their friends from outside the church to come. So we want to include the conversation, the congregation in prayer. We also want to make sure we have a prayer team. And this is so important, but a lot of churches skip this part. You should have a prayer team that's designated. That's what they do. They show up each week on Alpha. It can be just a couple of people. It can be a larger team of 8. It doesn't really matter how many people you have, but you need to have some people who are just designated for prayer. They can be the ones who lead the prayer huddle at the beginning of each Alpha. So that comes off the leader's role or the MC's role. And don't shortchange that prayer huddle. Like, give it a good 30, 45 minutes of time. You can have the prayer team doing one-on-one prayer ministry with each host and helper during the prayer huddle. I've seen a church in Iowa does this, and it is just beautiful. And, you know, the hosts and helpers are coming off of a full day themselves before they get to Alpha. And imagine then if you are being prayed on in the, like, as prayer ministry before you started leading your Alpha. How beautiful that would be. So we have the congregation involved in prayer. We have the prayer team. We also want to, and we have the prayer huddle happening regularly. And we also want to make sure that our hosts and helpers are praying for their guests every day by name. Every time when I'm a host or a helper on an Alpha course, this is what I do. It is so helpful for me then to extend radical hospitality when I'm in the small group, when every day I am praying for my guests by name, remembering what their prayer requests were and what some of the issues are that they're sharing in the small group time. So you have the congregation praying, you have a prayer team, you have the prayer huddle, and you have the hosts and helpers praying daily for each guest by name. This is the kind of prayer that really makes a difference, because not only does this invite the Holy Spirit to come in deeply, but it also changes us along the way. We say this all the time on Alpha, that Alpha is perfectly designed to fail unless God shows up, because Alpha doesn't save anyone. Alpha doesn't transform lives. Our role on Alpha is not to convert people, but to introduce them to Jesus and to pray for his Spirit to come. So this work is the Holy Spirit's work. There's this great definition of evangelism that I wanted to share with you. Evangelism is joining the conversation that God is already having around you. It's so important to remember that before your guests ever set foot into your Alpha, God is already at work having a conversation with them. So all we need to do is just show up and join him in this conversation. So as we wrap up this first point on prayer, I just want to ask you, how is your team's reliance on prayer? Just think about that as we move into the second point, which is creating the right team. So as you know, the team, the broader Alpha team, consists of the leader and an MC. They may or may not be the same person. The person who organizes your Alpha may be the MC, but maybe not. Your group of hosts and helpers, the hospitality team when you are in person. So they're setting up dinner, making dinner, cleaning up dinner. Your welcoming crew, and you should have, even online, you should have some people who are just, you know, designated for making sure that people feel welcome when they come in that Zoom room. The tech team and the prayer team, which we've already talked about. So Alpha espouses 5 creative values. On Alpha attempts to be friendly, inspiring, bold, authentic, and simple. And so we want our team members to reflect these same 5 values. So when we say friendly, that means that these team members need to be welcoming and accepting. And I think you know as well as I do that not every single person in your church is accepting of people who believe things differently than they do. So you need to think about that as you're forming your team. Are they accepting? Inspiring. This is to be uplifting and invitational and positive. And again, not everybody you find in church has an invitational, positive spirit about them. So pay attention to that. We should be bold, which is exciting and energetic. And again, not everybody in church is exciting and energetic. If we have a lot of low energy people on an alpha team, your alpha team itself will feel very low energy. It won't feel bold, and it might have, people might end up then feeling kind of awkward and out of place being there and just not really well welcomed. What is it to be authentic? Vulnerable, not a know-it-all. I think you know as well as I do that when we get, some people, as soon as we get into a church setting, we feel like we have to be a know-it-all when it comes to the Bible and share everything that we know about the Bible. This isn't going to work on alpha. Simple. What is that? No Christian jargon and no deep exegesis are two things that come to my mind about being simple. And again, this is something that for a lot of Christians is very difficult. We use the term, when we're in evangelism, so often we use the term winning people to God. It's very difficult to stay simple if you feel like you need to be winning somebody to God. When you use a lot of deep theological arguments to try to win somebody to God, that's not being simple. So how do these words really describe your team? Sometimes even in our efforts to be meek and mild as Christians, we kind of struggle with being bold and inspiring. How do you think about your team in terms of these 5 creative values? If these words don't describe your team members very well, think about how you can communicate these 5 values to your team and help them grow in the areas where they're currently weak. So the prayer huddle each week and the team training at the start of each new alpha, those are 2 great places to go over these values. And you should hold a training at the beginning of each alpha, even for seasoned veterans to attend, because this is a time where the group, the team can connect and gel together. It's a time for continued learning, for sharing stories, for prayer, of course, but also it's a time to help your team grow in some of these areas where they might be a little bit weak. And finally, you might, as you think of these 5 values, there might be somebody who comes to your mind right away, or a couple of somebodies at your church who really, really personify these 5 values. Well, go ahead and invite them to be on your team because they would bring those values with them. So before we leave the topic of the team, I just want to spend a few minutes looking at the role of the host, because the host is so important when we get to the small group conversation time. An alpha host is hosting a conversation and making people feel safe and included. It's so important that we understand that that's what's happening in small group. We have created a safe space for people to say whatever is on their mind. As strange or non-Christian as it might be, we are creating a safe space for them. An alpha host is not a teacher. It's not, the host is not really even the leader of this conversation. Think of a skilled dinner party host. So my husband and I, when we were in our late 20s, we had the opportunity to live in Paris for a couple of years. And so we went to a lot of different dinner parties that were hosted by French people. And the thing that was so different about their dinner parties was you would show up and you wouldn't know anybody other than the host. The whole point was to provide an opportunity for you to meet people that you didn't know and have a conversation and share ideas really in a safe space. So the host would make you feel welcomed and invited and accepted. They would introduce you to the other guests. They made you feel at ease. They would include you in the conversation. Never did the conversation turn to that host trying to teach us anything. That host was a facilitator of great conversation. And this is what we want our alpha hosts to look like. They should be personable, a good listener, non-judgmental, asking good open questions that spark good conversation. It's not someone who's going to be answering questions. If a question is asked of the host just wants to throw the question back to the group and say, well, what does anybody else think about that? a good question to ask about someone you're considering having as a host is, would my best friend or my savvy or cynical coworker be comfortable in this person's group with them as a host? Is this person comfortable with sticky conversations? Is this person comfortable leaving a conversation, a question, just like really open-ended and just kind of floating out there and doesn't need to bring everything to conclusion? If this doesn't describe that person you have in mind, then maybe that person needs more training, or maybe this isn't the right role for that person. It's really important that we match people with the right role on Alpha, the right role for them. So as we finish up talking about the team, a question for you. Are you creating the right team for your Alpha? So we've talked about prayer. We've talked about the team. Let's talk about inviting the right guests. It's important to reflect on who is in your Alpha. Many Alphas are formed solely or almost exclusively from people within the church. And if that's you, then no matter how much you pray or how perfect your team is, your Alpha won't feel like Alpha should. Alpha is designed for people who are outside the church, for people who don't yet know Jesus. And this is what we're also going to be talking about in the Creating a Great Commission Culture training in May. So our Alpha teams, they're meant to self-perpetuate, where your guests come from outside the church, and then they would return as helpers on the next Alpha, bringing their friends with them. And I think this is the point where many churches get stuck, is if they do have guests from outside the church, those guests don't come back as helpers the next year. But remember, we have to then go out and do the inviting. We have to ask them to come back as a helper. We need to be, as hosts in the different groups, be looking out for people that we could invite to come back as a helper. This is the way that a team can be self-perpetuating. At HTB, only about 50% of the team is the same like group of people who have been on the team for years. It's their ministry, it's what they do. The other 50% have just come off of Alpha, the most recent course or the most recent couple of courses. So look for your next Alpha team members on your current course and be proactive in inviting them to come back as helpers. The best way, the best sources of new guests for your next Alpha is from your current Alpha. So then here's the sticky question. What do you do about those strong Christians who are in your church who want to come on Alpha, but they want to come as a guest, not as part of the team? I can only recommend that you would be bold and you would tell them that they can only come if they bring an unbelieving friend.
Yeah.
If they can't, if they say, well, you know, I don't really know that many I don't have many unbelieving friends. And this is a reality. Barna just did a study with Alpha that revealed that 38% of church-going Christians say that they don't have any unbelieving friends. 38%. So for a lot of the people sitting in your church, they really don't have anybody to invite. So that's another whole ball of wax, another problem to solve. But if that is truly their case, and after you've recommended that they make some friends with people who are outside of the church to be salt and light, as Jesus said, yes, Tim's got his thumbs up, thank you. You could then just encourage them to come on the prayer team and to serve in that way and be praying, because that's such a vital role. You could also ask them to do a Taste of Alpha watch party in their small group or their Sunday school, where they would watch the first video and then do a small group discussion around it, and then start talking about and praying about who they can invite to Alpha. Remember, you want your Alpha to be filled mostly with people who are outside of your church. To have dynamic, vibrant, small group conversations, you have to get the right people to Alpha. And so you and your fellow church members are going to have to go out and invite them. So as we wrap up this portion of the training. My question is, are you inviting the right guests to your alpha? So as we move on to the fourth point, we have talked about prayer. We have talked about creating the right team and inviting the right guests. Now we're going to look at extending radical hospitality. And this really is what's happening as we get to alpha. This is the alpha night. It is so important on alpha that your team is communicating to your guests that you belong before you believe. And this really is the upside down approach to church. At church on a Sunday morning, you are welcome to come, but it feels pretty clear to a guest that until and unless you believe, you're not really going to belong there. I would like to just read a small excerpt from Craig Springer's new book, How to Revive Evangelism. It's a tiny little book packed with some great nuggets in it. Craig Springer is the executive director for Alpha USA. And this comes from his chapter called Belonging, Not Just Welcoming. What we sometimes fail to recognize is that many welcoming environments can actually make people feel very uncomfortable until they, the visitors, make a change. When we're welcoming, we unintentionally communicate, hey, you can sit at our table or in our seats, you can hear my thoughts, you can receive my messages, you can attend my events, and you can enter into this gathering and online space with us on our terms. Welcoming environments can often inadvertently feel like assimilation chambers. There's a natural distance that a welcoming, assimilation-focused environment can unintentionally impose on a discerning, post-everything audience. It's all smiles and kind words and even hot coffee. But at the end of the day, too many welcoming environments withhold the beyond the surface level belonging and involvement until the new person figures out what behaviors and beliefs are expected and they adhere to those. They can never quite feel like they belong until they decide to sign on the dotted line and swear off all the old ways or speak in the new vernacular. When outsiders finally make their way into any spaces within our churches or lives, too often we require them to believe like us before they can experience true belonging. So I'd like you just to kind of think about that and think about how true that is on the Sunday morning environment, and think about how nervous and intimidated and scared your alpha guests likely are, because they've probably had that very same experience going to church themselves. So what we need to do on alpha is to create a welcoming, non-threatening environment, an environment that is very invitational to them. So think about your guests' first moments with you. What does minute 1 feel like? What do the first 2 minutes feel like, both in person and online? The first 5 minutes, the whole evening. What does it feel like? Picture the scene. Imagine if you were brand new and maybe had some bad experiences with church and were already feeling uncomfortable. How would you feel? Well, one of our alpha leaders from the region, Dave Shoemaker, who's actually on this call today, he uses this great term called captains of fun. Find some captains of fun in your church and enlist them to be on your alpha team. We need some people who are outgoing, energetic, funny, who can be up there as sort of the front people, you know, the MC, people who are welcoming others as they come on the Zoom call in particular, but also your in-person alpha gatherings. And when you're in person, you're going to need an entire welcome team who's dedicated to ensuring that those initial minutes go well, beginning in the parking lot, in the hallway, going to the restroom, that people feel welcome and like they belong, even though they don't yet believe. If you're online, you really have to think about how you're filling that awkward silence when people are entering the Zoom room. Some churches will prepare a welcome video on a shared screen that they're showing. Others will have some music playing in the background, and not worship music, just just music so that it doesn't feel, again, so it doesn't feel intimidating. Other churches will make sure that people are not muted when they enter, and that the welcoming team says hello to everybody by name. Hi, Joe. Hi, Dan. Hi, Bob. Hi, Mary, and welcomes them. And hopefully then Joe, Dan, Bob, and Mary will say hello back, getting them to say something in the first few minutes of the call. Because when you think about an alpha night, there is the introduction part with the MC, there's the video, there's the moving to the small groups. Your guests will probably have 40 to 45 minutes without saying a word if you don't greet them beforehand and try to engage them in just a moment or two of a hello. So either approach is possible, but I'm just putting them out there. You need to think about how those moments are going and what does it feel like to be a guest on especially your online alpha. When you are in person, having some music playing that's a well-curated playlist that's upbeat. Again, it doesn't have to be Christian music. In fact, it probably shouldn't be, or shouldn't be exclusively Christian music. You want people to feel comfortable and like they belong before they believe. So our hospitality is being friendly and generously receiving others. But on Alpha, hospitality also means listening well. Author David Augsburger has said this, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. So on an Alpha online format, we really rely on our small groups to show this kind of hospitality. We show warmth and welcome and kindness and love by listening well and asking good questions, and then remembering what they said from one week to the next and following up with them. One of the best ways for us to remember what's going on in our guests' lives is to pray for them daily. Remember, I said that in the very beginning. This helps us to remember what's really on their hearts. And it really does help us extend radical hospitality to our guests. So remember, hospitality is helping people feel seen and known and heard and loved. So I would end this section by asking you, how hospitable are you and your Alpha team? So as we move on to the fifth category, the thing we're going to talk about today of facilitating great conversation, you might be wondering, Bonnie, okay, where is the secret stuff that I have been looking for? We've talked about prayer. We've talked about creating the right team, inviting the right guests, and extending radical hospitality. And we haven't really even moved into the small group room yet. Where's the secret stuff? As I said, the foundation that we lay for our alphas is super important. When we do those things that we've already talked about and do them well, we are set up to have excellent small group times. The rest is just simple. It's 5 simple steps to help you have great conversation and help people feel like they belong in your small group. And so as we talk about these, I'd like you to be thinking about, well, which ones are easy for your team and which ones you think your team kind of struggles with a little bit, and to, make note of that. So we want to ask you, I know you know this, we want to ask open-ended invitational questions. It's so important that we pay attention to our language. Again, I'm going to read something briefly from Craig's book. This is from the chapter, Conversation, Not Just Proclamation. There's something very peculiar about the way Jesus chose to interact with people during his short time on earth. The Bible records 307 questions that Jesus asked, along with 183 questions others asked of him. But do you know how many times Jesus gave a direct answer? 8. 8 times. And some scholars argue that on only 3 of those occasions was the answer he gave completely direct. Jesus was 40 times more likely to ask a question than to provide a direct answer. And this, coming from the one and only person who walked the earth and actually knew all the answers. So we want to make sure that our alpha small groups are not filled with times that we're answering questions. We're just allowing our dinner party guests to ask questions and have conversations with one another that help them get to the answers for themselves. So an open-ended question, is not asking a yes/no question. It's using words like what and how. So what do you think? How do you feel about? Tell me more about. It's easy to turn a closed yes/no question, like, do you think Jesus is God, into an open-ended question by saying, who do you think Jesus is? Well, now, if you want that question to be even more invitational than that, you could ask, what do you think it would have been like to hang out with Jesus? So see how that's an open-ended question, but it's also invitational. It reminds them that Jesus was a human being who walked the earth, and you could, if you lived then, you could have hung out with him. And then it engages their imagination. What do you think it might have been like to hang out with Jesus? So that's an invitational open-ended question. You might also consider flipping a question to the negative. So one of our go-to questions every week is, so what stood out to you in the video? You could flip that to a negative and say, was there anything in the video that you struggled with or you still have questions about? And that gives them permission to have questions and struggles with the material that they just heard. You could also, on the Bible week, ask them, instead of saying, how has your experience been with reading the Bible? You could flip it to the negative and say, well, what challenges have you experienced in reading the Bible? And that kind of question lets them know that it's okay that they struggle with reading the Bible. So the second thing is to be encouraging. Don't forget, as I've said a couple times already today, it is likely to be a scary, intimidating time for them, especially in the beginning. Once they get used to the small groups, they won't feel that way anymore. But in the beginning, it is especially scary and intimidating. So keep the conversation open and encouraging. They need to feel like this is a safe space to say whatever they feel, ask whatever question is on their minds. So affirm everything that they share. Especially if they reveal something personal or painful from their past, make sure that you're really encouraging what they say. And don't disagree, even if what they say is not what we believe. Just thank them for sharing that and say, that's really interesting. What does anybody else think about this? Small group is a time where we don't want to be correcting our guests for what they have shared. Again, think of it as a dinner party conversation. A good host is not going to correct people for what they've said. They just keep the conversation going. This is a time for friends to build long-lasting, authentic relationships. And remember, especially as you start to have more people coming to your alpha from outside your church, you will not be having people all agreeing with and having the same viewpoint. So and that's what you want. That's what makes livelier conversations in an alpha small group, is when people have differing viewpoints. So the goal is not agreement between your guests. It's to make sure that they feel heard and feel safe in asking their questions. So the third tip is to be yourself. Pay attention to your body language. 93% of what we say is nonverbal. We communicate what we mean 55% with our body language and 38% by our tone of voice, and only 7% by the spoken word. So be aware of your body language, especially on Zoom. Be aware of what's happening when you ask a question, what's happening with your eyes. Are you boring into people, or are you looking relaxed? Are you smiling for others, especially on Zoom? You know, we are cut off from the shoulders up. They can't read really what's going on. So make sure that you make it easy for them. By the same token, make sure you have some light behind your camera, behind your screen, so that people can see you and not really be struggling quite so much to try to read your body language, your facial expressions. The 7% of what you have to say is not enough for them to understand that you are authentically interested in what they have to say. Be honest, just really be honest. If someone asks a question, and they will, when you talk about, what about evil? You will not have the answers to all those questions. Probably most nights you won't have the answers to all the questions that will be raised. And just be comfortable with the tension of saying, I don't know. I don't know. Remember, we want them to know God, not just answers to theological questions. And people have authenticity radars. They can just sniff you out if you're just kind of not being genuine and just making something up to make yourself look better. We want to offer high empathy and high listening skills, but that doesn't mean that we have to have all the answers to all the difficult questions that people have. So that leads to tip number 4. Don't answer all the questions. And you know who you are out there. And this is the hardest part for many people. We like to help people, and we like having the right answers, right? And sharing them. But remember, you're not the teacher. You're a dinner party host. And as soon as you position yourself as the one with all the answers, people will stop engaging with one another and they'll only talk to you. So if someone asks you a specific question, again, try to deflect it, try to offer it to somebody else and resist the temptation to answer it yourself. Also resist the temptation to reteach any of the content from any of the videos or to share any of the super cool Bible facts that you know. Just remember, we've been steeping in this stuff for a long time. Give space for God to work in your guests' hearts and let them catch up on their own. And this is why this is super important. As you know, we live in a postmodern, post-Christian world. The good thing about being postmodern rather than modern is people are coming to believe again that there is truth. It's not the truth, but there's a truth, and it can be found, their own truth. Alpha is presented in a postmodern approach. We present information to our guests for them to process, to discuss, and to grapple with. We don't tell them what to believe. We rely on the Holy Spirit to help them find their truth, which we will know to be the truth. But on their journey, they're just trying to discover their own truth. So do you see why it's so essential that you have a prayer team that is praying constantly while you are in small group? Because the work that we are doing is not to convince people of the truth. It's to present Jesus Christ to them and ask the Holy Spirit to show up and move as only He can do. So reflect here a little bit. What do your small groups look like? Are the guests engaging with each other? Or are they more frequently directing the questions back to the host? We just really have to constantly remind ourselves on Alpha that we're not driving the bus. This is our guest's journey with the Holy Spirit, and it's not ours. So just trust the Holy Spirit. We don't need to spoon feed our guests. The Holy Spirit is at work with them. And just a couple of potential landmines to address. You may have to remind some of your guests that they're not the teacher either. If you have a guest who seems to dominate the conversation, try to connect with them afterward and encourage them to make space for others to share. And if they're a believer, you may have to encourage them to resist the urge to teach too much also. It's important that we don't have any guests in our groups who are trying to preach to everyone else. So just try to help someone who's like this come to realize the importance of letting everybody come to their own conclusions about what we're sharing. And if you have an out of left field sort of a question, you can always just respond with, oh, that's a great question, and I'd love to explore that with you. But tonight, let's try to stay on the topic at hand, and we'll talk about that offline. And then do follow up with them and have that conversation with them. But that just kind of redirects your small group conversation. And finally, don't be afraid of silence. We all process at different speeds. The average speed is about 6 seconds for someone to think and process and come up with an answer. But for many people, it can take as long as 30 seconds to really come up with their response to what's been said. So it can be really helpful to state your small group guidelines at the beginning, on the first week. And then you can, just remind them anytime later after a couple of weeks. Oh, I just want to just remind everyone of what we talked about on the first week. This is how we're going to interact with each other. We're going to let everybody talk. We're going to listen to one another. We're going to be aware of how much we're talking compared to others. We're going to allow for some silence so that our quieter guests can speak. We're going to keep confidentiality and respect different opinions. So if you share that on week one, you can remind them of that at any time when you feel like the small group conversation isn't going quite as what an alpha small group conversation should be. So just remember, we get richer conversations when we allow everyone to have an opportunity to speak, and that might mean just waiting a little bit more for quieter ones to catch up. So as we wrap up today, and then I'm just going to have a time of Q&A and just discussion, I'm wondering if you guys could maybe just put in the chat of these 5 essentials of a dynamic small group, which one or ones do you think you need to be working on most in your alpha? Relying on prayer, creating the right team, inviting the right guests, extending radical hospitality, or facilitating great conversation. It might just be nice if you don't mind doing that, just put that in the chat and we can all just share. And then I'm going to open it up for some Q&A and stop sharing the screen. Before we leave the screen share, I just want to remind you of some upcoming events. We're beginning a regional marriage course next week on Wednesday, April 28th. It's open to all and everyone at all of your churches as well. Our regional alpha marriage leaders will be leading that, so you don't have to do any of the work. We do the registration, we do the facilitation, we do the whole thing. So that's on our website. Also on May 6th, we're having an Alpha Connect cohort gathering. That's just really a time to share ideas with one another about how your alphas are going, and to get some new ideas, some best practices from one another. And then the training that I was referring to, creating a great commission culture in your church, that is on May 20th. And I encourage you all to sign up for that as well. So we're just going to open it up now to a time of Q&A and just any thoughts, sharings that anybody has.
Yeah, Bonnie, Dan Gifford here. I got one, if you wouldn't mind. We didn't talk too much about the distinction of the role between host and helper, but this question relates to helpers. A few of us, including Thomas, who's on this call, had a call yesterday with our friend Ken and Karen Volpert out at Vintage Church in California. And they said that their helpers play the role of chief doubter. And what they do is the helper is responsible for, particularly in the early weeks, of throwing out, doubting questions or really answers to questions, right? Traditionally, the helper, we've been told, is to be quiet, perhaps focus on hospitality, and then once everybody else has spoken, then they can talk. But this was radically different from that model, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think that's an excellent idea. It's not something that we're sort of hearing from Alpha USA leadership, but I think so much of what happens is that it's boots on the ground, where it starts in the grassroots in churches, and then it kind of moves upstream and those ideas are shared. I love that idea because I think that, again, like I was sharing, it gives people permission to feel what they feel. And so if there's someone who is, really setting the example and lighting the way that way, I think that's highly, highly impactful. I think it's one of the things I recommend if churches are trying to do a pilot alpha for their team, that's not open yet to the church. It's just for the team, the first round of the team to learn how to do it. I do recommend that you would have to have some people who are the doubters who play that role, or you won't have an authentic conversation in small groups. So I think that's a wonderful idea.
And just adding to what Dan just shared, Ken and Karen also shared one other thing that the helper does is being vulnerable. When a vulnerable question is thrown out, the helper sort of sets the tone in being vulnerable so that it gives the others the freedom to do it as well. That was another thing that they shared.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I couldn't agree more. I think it's really important that someone is the first one to dip their toe in the water. So yeah, I would encourage that, and especially if you have a prayer team, and I hope now after today that's not an if, but a since you have a prayer team, that kind of takes the pressure off the helper to be quiet and just praying, but to assume a different sort of role to try to get people to open up a little. Yeah, great question.
Thank you.
Anybody else, some thoughts or?
We've had, I was pleased because we've had several of our church leaders get onto Alpha this time. And it seems like this is only our second time doing it. And I think it was great that they got on. I know what you said, well, they don't come on unless you bring an unsaved friend. But now they know what Alpha is all about by getting on here. And now that's where we need to, as the team, we need to emphasize that. Now go out and start inviting your unsaved and unchurched friends. Because in our church, it was exactly as you said, Bonnie. It's like, oh yeah, well, that's their thing. It's almost like it was treated like another small group or something, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it was really hard the first time around to get a lot of the church leaders behind it. So I was super pleased that we had quite a few church leaders, and they stayed. We only got 2 sessions left, and they're still with us. So praise the Lord.
That's so good. That's so good. Yeah. Yeah.
Bonnie, if I may ask a question. I am leading my first Alpha group, and we have a couple people in the group with me from the church to help. And then we have like 5 people whose spiritual status is, I would say, quite dubious. I think mostly really, truly just unbelievers. It's just kind of hard for me to imagine at the end of this, just sort of dropping those people, with no follow-up or anything. But yet I kind of get the idea that that's how it works. Can you explain this to me?
Yeah, well, I think those people, it would be great to invite them to come back as a helper. So this would be in the traditional model that of host and helper. So where, as Dan had mentioned, the traditional model is where the helper is quiet and just prays for people. So often people who have had a good experience on Alpha, but have not yet necessarily made a commitment to Jesus, they're feeling better about things. Some of their questions have been answered. Some of the burden has been lifted that they've carried, but they haven't yet made a commitment to Christ. They're invited to come back and be a helper. And so they go through it again. Some people, it's like on the 2nd or 3rd time that they actually come to faith in Jesus. So
hey, Bonnie,
yeah.
I thought you were done. I was going to add something.
Yeah, so I think that's something definitely to consider. I know at HTB that is definitely what is done, and it's some people, they need to hear the message a few times. So I would recommend that for sure. Charlie.
Yeah, I was going to follow that up and say that person could come back as a helper / doubter, because it'll come naturally.
Yeah.
You know, it really just gives him or her a second opportunity to go through alpha and yet feel like I have a role to play here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and as you said in the beginning, belonging is more important than believing, especially at the beginning. So that's how that all kind of fits together, I think.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think that that again, just inviting them to come back, saying you are highly valued. We want to see you here. Would you come back? We need you on the team. Would you be a helper? They'll probably say, well, I don't really know what I believe. I don't have answers to the questions. Like, well, that's okay. You belong here anyway. So.
Well, okay, that's good. Now, this group that we're doing is online. In Alpha, as it's traditionally been before the pandemic, the connection with the church would be rather obvious because you're at the church. Mm-hmm. But for the online groups, is it considered kosher to at least invite them to come to church?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things you want to make sure is that you have options for people at the end of Alpha. And so for every church, that's going to look different. Some do something that really is to understand, you know, the nuts and bolts of their denomination. Others, it's really kind of a follow-on to faith or some sort of basic Christianity course. But I really wouldn't neglect inviting people to come back a second time to Alpha and serve on the team, a second and third time, and to bring their friends. If they've had a good experience, they will come back with their friends, or they should come back with their friends. And that's the way that you get the team to be self-perpetuating. And it's really a way to help someone who hasn't yet come to faith come to faith.
I understand and accept that. But you're also saying that it is okay to have other sort of follow-up events that you can invite them to, yes. I guess. So that's good. Yes. Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry, but I have to go now. But thank you very much. This was very good. Thank you.
Glad you could join us.
Bonnie, I had a quick note if we have time. We had, let's see, we just finished our 3rd week of Alpha in person. We're doing online and we're doing in person as well. And our group was about half seekers and half believers. And I felt like the believers were kind of taking over after week 2. So I started last night out by saying, I really appreciate and I'm really inviting people who are wrestling with things to share and open up. So I encourage you to do that night. And if you have something to say and add to the conversation, please don't preach or talk about your view. Just say how God has spoke to you personally about it. And it changed the whole climate of the group.
Wow, that's a great insight. Thanks for sharing that, Dave. Oh, and Dave, if you didn't recognize, this is the captain of fun. So, but thank you for sharing that. I think that's, sometimes we don't want anybody's feelings to be hurt, and we can end up being a little too shy instead of just being direct and saying what needs to be said. So that's.
And in the middle of it, somebody started to preach and I literally put my hands up, stood up, and I said, time out, you're preaching, stop. So I guess I'm not bashful about being direct, but it was good for everybody else in the group. And after week 1, 3 new people came because they brought other friends. So it's been a pretty dynamic and growing group. So, but being clear about sharing and not preaching, what has God told you personally? That seemed to be a good message, and that opened up people that were quiet before to share what they're wrestling with. So it was really a much better conversation.
That's so great. And just in what you just shared there, you're speaking about safety. People felt safe as you're telling people to stop preaching. That lets somebody know this is a safe space for me to invite my friends, and also lets them know it's a safe space for me to say what I'm struggling with. And that's so important. So yeah, that's another tip. Be bold. I guess one of our values, be bold in correcting people in the group who really are preaching too much. Yeah. Well, we are at exactly 1 o'clock. I don't want to take any more time. I am going to stop the recording, but then if anybody wants to stay on, I am here to stay longer with you. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here today. I hope that I'll get to see you at one of the other trainings or the Alpha Connect cohort gathering, and hopefully someday in person as well. So God bless you all, and stick around if you have any other questions.